economic advisor to ever give a speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So several years ago, I should have known this was going to happen. We have a great panel this afternoon. We'll start with Alan Montgomery of Carnegie Mellon, and take it away, Alan.
Thank you. So this is joint work with Mike Smith, and Mike is a faculty member at Heinz. I'm at the Tepper School of Business, and also our PhD student, Zhao Ying. The broad question is one I'm sure everyone wants to know the answer to, which is what's the effect of streaming on purchasing, and also vice versa, to try to figure out, are they complements or are they substitutes? I'm going to try to answer that question. I will be able to answer that question. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer to your satisfaction or to the generality that even I want to. But what I'd like to do is just sort of start off with a related question, which is actually what drove us in this research. So the original motivation for our work was based on movie piracy. So a few years ago, we started doing some work on understanding what the effect of piracy was. And this led to a development of a more elaborate statistical model to try to capture what's going on in movies. So at the time, we were really thinking about movies having a couple different effects. One is cannibalization and also promotional effect. All right, so the argument for movie piracy, the downside obviously is the substitution. So if more people listen or watch using a pirated copy, they're much less likely to go back and watch or pay for the actual copy. But there's also a promotional effect that could be out there. So the promotional effect is that even though I haven't paid for the copy, I still behave as if I have paid for the copy. So you've got positive word-of-mouth effects. They pass the message along to somebody else, and that somebody else might go ahead and make the purchase. So it's quite clear that cannibalization is a bad thing. It's possible, though, that the promotional effects could be strong enough to offset the negative effects of substitution. That's not the case, but it's still a possibility. So what we did was we set about building a model that this model was built for movie box office, but it took into account advertising, both post and pre-release, availability, and also the occurrence of piracy. So we had a lot of effects that are going on. We're able to capture awareness and word of mouth. We also have forgetting in the model. We have things like marketing mix effects, advertising, availability, the number of screens, so that's constraints on the distribution. And finally, we're going to do this at the individual movie level, and we're going to try to take a look at what sales look like on a weekly basis. All right, so here's a glimpse of the model. I won't go into mathematics of the model, but the notion here is that people have different states. So they can start off as undecided. They're unaware. Alternatively, they become aware and they're willing to consider. After they consider, they could go ahead and make the purchase, and then they're either going to transition to become positive or negative. It's also possible that they forget, which means they move back to the undecided state, or they could stay in the consider state because maybe a product isn't available or they're not able to find it. All right, the other couple of states are at the end. After I've listened or watched, I'm positive or negative in terms of spreading of the information, and then finally I become inactive. Or alternatively, I could just reject. So it's a horror movie. I don't like horror movies, so as a consequence, I'm never going to watch this movie. So there's a lot that's going on, but some of the important things are to understand that the probabilities of moving between these states depend upon what everyone else is doing. So if this is a great movie and lots of other people are talking about it, then I'm much more likely to learn about it myself and transition from that undecided to the consider state. Or if the movie is readily available at the box office, I'm much more likely to be able to move from that consider to the purchase state as well. All right, so in interest of time, I won't talk a lot about what the results are for the movie side, but I do want to try to show you a couple of pictures to try to illustrate what the model's doing and why we think this is relevant and interesting for music. So what you're looking at are the actual sales for Mission Impossible 3. So this is at a weekly basis. The axis over here at 0 tells us what were sales the week before release. So week 1 is going to be the week of release. So the box office revenue is somewhere between $50 and $60 million for that week. And then we also have over here on the other line what the advertising was. Then finally we have the advertising screens. So the reason I show you this is that it's a really easy series to forecast, and you ask yourself the question, why do we need to have a sophisticated model for something like this? And the truth is you don't. Any intern should be able to fit an exponentially declining curve to this, but the interesting thing that comes out from the model is that you can try to start extracting things like awareness. So over here I can try to come up with an estimate of what's the percentage of people that are actually willing to consider this movie. I can also go back and take a look at what's the rejection state. I can see what's the percentage of people that are undecided in the marketplace. Now, the reason that we're really interested in this, we think that awareness is going to be critical to being able to forecast what music sales are going to be across lots of different channels. All right, so the last graph was really easy to forecast. Here's an illustration where it's really difficult to forecast. So this is Slumdog Millionaire. What you see is there's actually pre-release sales because it has a staged release. It was not in very many theaters initially. Gradually it started to build. Then all of a sudden it was ready to withdraw from the market. You see that the sales actually start to go down. But then it gets a boost later on. In this case, the number of screens, it looks like they sort of overcompensate it. So they figure out, this is going to be a great movie, but not until actually the peak occurs. So this is atypical, but what I would like to point out is that our model actually does a really good job of forecasting a difficult model. And the reason that it does well is it's decomposing and thinking about awareness and availability and all kinds of other effects. All right, so the bottom line of this story is that piracy is a bad thing. It reduces sales at the box office by, say, 16% at release. If you've got pre-release that comes out 8 weeks beforehand, it reduces it by 22%. Also, to answer that question, piracy has both a promotional and also cannibalization effect. So we can do some counterfactual simulations and ask the question, well, what if we turn off the promotional effect? So what would happen if piracy has no promotional effect? So remember, in our model, we can capture these word-of-mouth effects. It turns out that things would be worse. So in other words, the added lift from promotion really isn't that great. So the reason that I wanted to provide this is really my motivation for why I got into this particular project. After we did it, we were approached by a studio. The studio said, this is great, we've got music data for you. We'd like you to take your model and put it to our data. I said fine, because I had worked with music data about 15 years ago, and I also remember it had these nice exponentially declining patterns, and I said it shouldn't be hard at all. It turns out that's not the case. It's actually really difficult. So what we did initially was to try to pick this model up and then think about piracy as a channel, and then we're also thinking about other types of channels that were available. So what does our data look like? Well, our data is sales and streaming for 50 randomly selected songs that we were provided. We asked for all the data, but we got a small subset, and we were promised to get more later, and hopefully we'll get more later. Half the songs are on the Billboard 200, the other half aren't, and this is what our data looks like. So again, just imagine 50 series that look pretty much like this. So over here is Spotify, and then down below you can see iTunes, And then finally, Apple Music is over here. So we've got lots of different channels, and our goal is to try to figure out how does the change in Spotify impact the sales down below. All right, so after looking at this, we realized that it didn't fit our preconceived notions of what was supposed to happen. The album sales on iTunes do behave as you expect. It's exponentially declining. On the other hand, if you overlay all 50 plots on top of one with Spotify streaming, it's much harder to pick out the pattern over here. So again, in the interest of time, I won't go through and talk about the differences between EST and streaming. It's there. The slides are also available. What I want to do is just give you a couple different econometric models that we fit to the data that we have, and try to give you a sense of the learnings and what we think the next steps are. All right, so the first thing is to take a vector all-regressive model. So essentially what we're going to say is that the sales on Spotify are related to the sales on iTunes. This is a linear model or a log linear relationship. And what we find after going across all 42 songs is that a 1% increase in iTunes yields about a 2% increase in Spotify. For those that care, this is statistically significant, but it's not an overwhelming result. There's also another result that says there's a... this is weekly data, and the sales for the albums fall somewhere between 1 and 5 years. Most are going to be a couple of years of duration for the data that we see. We also see that there's a 1% increase in Spotify yields, a 12% decrease in iTunes sales, but you also notice that there's a lot of variability. This one's a much harder thing to estimate. If you pay attention to statistical significance, what you could say is that we're not sure. It's possible that Spotify has no effect on iTunes sales. It's also possible that it has a dramatic negative effect, or maybe a slightly positive effect. Our best guess is that Spotify is decreasing sales. So if you, instead of looking at the average, if you start thinking about each of the individual albums, remember we've got 50 albums. 8 of the albums didn't have enough data, so we tossed those out. What you're looking at here is a measure of the effect of iTunes sales on Spotify streams. So again, on average, it's positive. You'll see some have very strong positive effects, which means that iTunes is definitely increasing what Spotify, the number of streams. On the other side, though, you also have a few that are substantially significant that are saying the exact opposite. So when you average some really positive things with a few negative things and then a bunch of things that are in between, on net, it is positive. If you go the other way and take a look at Spotify streams on iTunes sales, again, what it looks like is that there is a subset of the songs, say about 10%, maybe 20% of the albums, where you definitely can measure a negative effect. So here's measures of substitution, but there are still a couple out there where it looks like you can get some complementarity relationship between those. All right, so again, I think this is interesting. This is a linear model. The problem with linear models is that they're not self-exciting. So we also wanted to take a look at something that can capture word-of-mouth effects. One of the original motivations for the other model is that we've got interaction. So one person can tell something to somebody else, and all of a sudden they dramatically increase the overall sales. So this is something called a Hawkes process. It's not an incredibly popular model, at least in most econometric circles. In finance, there are some applications of it to try to figure out about stock trading and also bank defaults. In scientific applications, some of the most popular applications have been earthquakes. So again, if you know anything about earthquakes, what you know is that they tend to cluster together. So you'll get one, and then within a short period of time, there's a higher likelihood that you'll get one soon thereafter. All right, so why is this relevant to online music? Well, we think that the same thing could be happening. You get the social influence. People start talking, and as they talk to one another, that excites people about the music. So this is an effect that isn't captured in the linear model. All right, so down here is this measure of intensity. So it's trying to give you a sense of when are the sales going to occur. Or alternatively, you can try to take a look at the cumulative plot to try to figure out when sales occur. So the main thing we're looking for is this bursty, clusty behavior. Another way to explain the same models is a branching model. So you've got some people that adopt the music and then they start passing along to their friends. So these are sort of the subsequent people that get picked up because of these initial people that purchase or start distributing the music or incite diffusion effect. So again, if you look at this plot, what you notice is that most of these are coming from branching behavior. In fact, the branches can be pretty deep. And then there are a few that are coming from, say, a primary source. So in my initial expectation, advertising might be our initial source to try to build the awareness. Or it could be Spotify or other streams, or say getting onto the right list. This is the mathematics behind it. Again, in the interest of time, I'll skip over the math. The important thing is to ask the question, can we try to figure out whether there's this self-exciting behavior? So over here is a measure of the self-exciting behavior. It goes from a scale from 0 to 1. So the closer I am to 1, it means the more branches I'm getting. So in other words, most of the behavior is coming from those word of mouth, so those interactions. So this time plot down below tells you how long the music has been available. So at 0 days, what you see is that the branching behavior is very high, and then gradually it starts to decline. So after you're a year into the cycle, less than half is coming from branching as opposed to initially. We can also go back and take a look at iTunes. So iTunes is going to decrease faster than Spotify streaming. I'm sorry, this is iTunes and this is Spotify streaming over here on the right. We can also try to measure interactions between these. So is Spotify encouraging people to talk and interact, and is that subsequent showing up in some kind of dynamic effect? And the answer is it doesn't look like that. What we still see, as is with the linear model, is that iTunes is having a deliberate effect on Spotify. It's a measurable effect. But when we go the opposite direction and start asking the question, is Spotify impacting iTunes album sales? Again, if anything, it looks like it's slightly negative, which means, again, they tend to be substitutes, not complements. All right, so what do we learn? Well, I think the interesting thing is that we've got a couple very different types of models. One model is looking at a linear relationship. It's not saying anything about sort of self-exciting behavior. The other model is trying to say, no, let's capture all kinds of word-of-mouth communication that's in this marketplace. What we see is the endogenous feedback seems to play a large part in Spotify and also iTunes album sales. So unfortunately, we don't have individual level data, so we can't go back and start saying things like, are the people different? What are the actual messages that people are giving back and forth that are leading to these changes? But the conclusion is that my best guess is that iTunes impacts listening behavior, but doesn't work the other way around. That's not true for all albums. That's true for the average album. If you look at the data, what you'll find is that there's certainly a strong component where you'll find both complementary as well as substitution behavior. So that's just sort of an average effect overall. So the next steps for us are to work on getting better, more data, and also trying to start bringing in lots of other things like social media, feeds and measures, and also try to reconcile the differences across models. Okay, so I think I'm close to on time. I'm on time. Okay, I have a couple minutes for questions.
Yes, so I think we'll do this session a little differently from the last one and do a quick 5 minutes of questions with each presentation. I'll kick it off while you're thinking about your question. How do you connect this finding with what we were seeing in the last set of presentations on the kind of secular shift away from downloads as a way people consume music towards streaming as kind of a predominant way of consumption? What are the implications of these lessons for given that fact?
Again, where I'm headed with this is that there's a latent process about awareness. And what we'd like to be able to do is try to figure out what awareness is and how awareness is trying to influence what people are doing. Our major motivation is that there's a common awareness, and it doesn't really matter whether I'm in streaming or whether it's physical. Awareness is common across all of these different platforms. So for me, if that hypothesis is correct, it's more about what's the value that I find in the particular channels and how that's going to differentially drive my sales. Again, from our standpoint, our thinking about this is that there's something driving the underlying behavior, and that's what we really want to try to focus on. Not so much what does iTunes look different than Spotify or Pandora. Yes.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Fowler from Belmont University. In the data that you had, were you able to segment your artists by genre? Because genre could potentially have a different impact going both directions.
Yes. With 50 songs, no, because we had a smattering across all the genres, so we just don't have enough to reliably say. Again, my expectation is that there are just certain types of songs, and I don't know whether it's the genre, whether it's the artist, whether it's the cycle, how old the artist is. There are a lot of things that can be contributed to it.
Yes.
Acoustics Lab. Based on the data you've collected and analyzed, is there any insight that you can draw on whether subscribers from one service jump to the other, or whether each service has its own population and
Yeah, again, that's a great question. That's one of the questions that we'd also like to answer, which is are people separated? So our Apple listeners over here and our Amazon listeners over here and our Spotify there, or is there a lot of mixing across the groups? If we have enough information, I think we could probably tease that out. We don't have enough information. So it's really just speculation on my part whether there's a lot of overlap between these or whether the audience are separate. In the conversations with the studio, their reaction is, no, the groups are separate, and the people that are listening to Spotify are just not going to buy on Amazon, or so that was their explanation of why they think these are separate.
Ready?
Alan, have you been able to look at the return on promotional activity?
What metric do you have in mind for return?
Dollars.
Dollars.
So, are the labels or the artists investing enough in promotion, or are they over-investing in promotion?
Our data set doesn't have advertising dollars. I can tell you that the returns seem pretty good for movies. So again, my expectation is that it would be similar, but perhaps not. And without data about advertising, it also comes back to just the different economics across the channels. So you might be willing to subsidize streaming at a lower price than you get from others if you really have these strong promotional effects. So again, I think we can answer it using the method, just not right now.
We'll do one more quick one while Joel comes up. Okay. Sorry, there's a this side of the room bias coming from.
Hi, I'm Sarita Stewart from Belmont University. And the question I have for you is, the way that you actually define your sample set was like half of like the songs. I just wondered how much familiarity actually came into that, right, with your promotion. Like, I thought it was really interesting. but I just was kind of wondering how that effect came into play.
Well, in our initial request to the studio, we said, look, we don't want to bias towards one genre or another, or more recent, or a catalog. So we said, let's just get a very broad sample. The original number of requests that we made had a few extra zeros beyond the 50. Actually, I think there were about 3 or 4 more zeros, because we said just give everything to us. What we ended up getting was a smaller sample, and it should be balanced. It is stratified that half are in the Billboard 200 and the other half aren't. But beyond that stratification, everything else should be random.
Maybe one more while we figure out the IT.
I dragged it to the desktop.
Two things. One, curious if you looked at radio as a variable. So that wasn't there already.
No, we don't have radio. So again, that would be a good thing to have. It would be good to have all listens and try to figure out what's the substitution across those.
That, to me, when we talk about social and things like that, seems to be the big one-to-many broadcast piece that could drive a lot of those things, and I think radio probably has a big impact on both of those things. The other thing, and just because we ran some analysis like this a couple of years back, one of the things that we saw with streaming, and I'm curious if you look this way or not, one of the things that we saw in streaming was that the longer a person was in a streaming service, the less likely they were to go back to buying. And sort of like
Oh, there it is.
the first 2 or 3 months after somebody joins a streaming service, they buy more music than they ever have before. And then after that, they go, wait a minute, why am I buying all this stuff? I'm just going to stream like crazy. And their buying goes straight down, where after 6 months, they're actually below where they were before. And maybe that was another thing we could look at as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. It is something I've been thinking about. This would be more of a structural view of how consumers are making decisions. So like one of the reasons I buy albums is I know that I have ownership to the music, and I can listen as many times in the future and wherever I want and whenever I want. So as I start thinking about switching over to streaming services, I'm left with trying to figure out, do I think it'll be available in the future or not, and will I be able to find it? So there are a lot of other considerations that come in, but definitely those are things that should and could be embedded.
Thank you, Alan.
Sure.
Joel Waldfogel of National Bureau of Economic Research, University of Minnesota, is going to tell us, does digitization threaten local culture?
Great, thank you. So do I need a microphone? Or maybe I do am I supposed to just take one of these? Oh, this one. Gosh, oh, there we go. I guess I can just stand back here. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I know many of you, but many of you I don't know, and so I'm looking forward to the opportunity to chat about all kinds of things, including this talk, but I do a lot of work on music. This is just one subset. So this kind of lives at the interstices between the long tail and globalization and streaming, so I guess that's why I'm in this particular session. Anyways, generally, the world has moved toward free trade in most products, but there's a big exception for cultural products, and in particular, this is a view in Europe, and nobody sort of does it better than the French. So here's Mitterrand saying, let us be on guard if the spirit of Europe is no longer menaced by the great totalitarian machines that we've known how to resist. It may be more insidiously threatened by new masters, economism, mercantilism, the power of money, and to some extent technology. What is at issue is the cultural identity of nations, the right of each people to its own culture, the freedom to create and choose one's images. A society that relinquishes to others its means of representation is an enslaved society. Now, you don't hear that kind of thing in an economics talk very often. Anyways, as a result of those kinds of attitudes, there is a lot of protectionism about culture in Europe. So there are radio quotas, there are a lot of film subsidies, and although I'm kind of poking fun at this perspective, I have a lot of sympathy for it. Before digitization, I did a lot of research on kind of the plight of small groups of people with unusual preferences and wrote a book called The Tyranny of the Market. So although I'm poking fun at the French, I get their perspective. Now, so if you think about what digitization has done, traditionally, if you think about it, cultural products were protected by the de facto high costs of trade. It was really pretty hard to make products available in other countries. If you think about music, you've got to find somebody then to sort of produce the product there and put it in stores, and most of it ends up not selling, so it's very expensive to make products available. But starting in 2003, well, there's the iTunes, music stores around the world. Now, It's not the case that every country has all the same products, but essentially all the high-value products are available everywhere with no stockouts. So starting in 2003, there's this opportunity for many products to be available to many people, which should be very scary to a cultural protectionist. And then fast forward to 2008 and 2011, when streaming comes along, now not only is essentially everything available essentially everywhere, but no marginal price. The price to listen to an additional song is zero. So now really people have the opportunity to choose not just the things that are expensive to make available, the small number of products nearby, but essentially everything. Okay, so yeah, there we go. The cultural protectionist nightmare. A lot of fair use in these slides. So now, a few years back, about almost 10 years ago, I wrote a paper looking at 50 years of popular music trade. We thought at the time, it's about 2005, well, we've been through a lot of technological change. Now would be a good time to look at this because after all, the internet has come along and MTV, which isn't technology, but is a communication institution. And so now should be a time when we could see, if technology were to threaten local culture, we might have seen it. What we found rather surprisingly using 50 years of pop chart data that we turned into trade data was, again, rather surprisingly, the home shares, the domestic shares actually went up around the world between 1995, especially in 2005. So technology seemed not to be the enemy of local culture, but rather somehow its friend. But I guess that was before iTunes and before Spotify, and so revisiting this question, now seems, I think, seems appropriate because if you're worried about technology making products available from around the world, well, now it's really happened. So now asking what has happened in light of that seems like maybe an important question. Okay. So the question here is, how has digitization affected trade in cultural products? Music is the context here. In some other work, I try to look at movies. And the questions I'll try to ask in this are, how have trade frictions evolved with digitization? And just to be clear about that up front, I'll be thinking about that largely in terms of the share of consumption that's domestic. There are some fancier ways to measure it that we do in the paper, but I probably won't talk about them much today. Have consumption patterns grown more similar across countries? And by the way, it's not obvious to me that would be a good or a bad thing, but some people who observe culture get worried when countries consume similar things. There's a Stepford wife creepiness or something about it. Another kind of question is whether production has grown more or less concentrated in particular origin countries. That is, are some countries coming to dominate the world? And a related question, how have the repertoires of the small and the large countries, particularly the US, fared in this more digital world, in this increasingly digital world? And I should also say, we have digitization, but we also kind of have which includes iTunes and all that. But when we look at Spotify, that's a glimpse into the future because we're really moving toward streaming rather quickly. Now, for the economists in the room, you might be scratching your heads thinking, this sounds like a very mercantilist exercise. And I thought we've known for about 200 years that mercantilism is not a doctrine we should be thinking about. But if you do think about what the concerns that animate the debates around cultural trade, they are very mercantilist. And so I realize that I'm taking that perspective, but it's to fit into that debate and be helpful, I hope, to that debate. Okay, so what do we have here? We have data on 17 countries, two kinds of data. Now, I've already started complaining about data, and Alan had to shut me up. But, the thing is, data are hard to get, and so what I can get here, I'm a little proud of, even though it's nowhere near what I wish I had. So here's what I have. I have Spotify streams. Spotify very generously releases its top 200 by day by country and by week by country. So I have that for 2 years, 2014 and 15, for the top 200 streams, number of streams, songs for 17 countries. And then I also have pop charts. So pop charts are pretty readily available, and the reason I have these 17 countries is I can get both the pop charts and the Spotify streams for the same 17. For those I have rather from 2004 to 2015. So with these two sets of data, I'll be able to ask a couple of kinds of questions. One is, how has the consumption via pop charts, which I'm going to pretend is digital downloads, when in fact it isn't just that, it's that plus other stuff. How does that evolve over time? And then secondly, how does pop charts versus Spotify streaming compare in the 2014-15 period, which is a kind of recent period? Now, there are a couple of maybe details that are worth mentioning. So to turn this into trade data, I've got to know something about where the artists are from. So I do a lot of kind of legwork or whatever, internet legwork, looking at Wikipedia and AllMusic and so forth, music brains, to see where artists are from. And so it's possible to turn these into trade data. The other thing is with pop charts, the rank, but not the quantity. but sales quantities tend to follow power laws, and so there are not unreasonable estimates one can make, assuming, for example, that the second ranked song sells half as much as the first, and the third a third as much as the first, and so forth. All right, the other thing is, as we all know, Spotify originated in Northern Europe, and so if one were to look just at the quantity of streams and not weight countries, it would look as though Norwegian artists are a really big deal, but they are a big deal, it's going to turn out, but they're not that big a deal. So we're going to weight the shares in the countries by the sizes of the countries, so we don't make Scandinavia look any more important than it is. And it is, if you know the history of music, quite important. All right, so when you do this, maybe a first slide to look at is just some data. This is just a standard kind of trade matrix that says where is music from and to, and so the destinations across the top, Australia, Canada, Germany, Spain, and so forth, origins down this way. So the yellow stuff are the interesting things. The main diagonal is interesting. What is it? It's the share of consumption that's domestic. Now, every study of trade anyone's ever done has shown what's called home bias. Right? People tend to consume things from the domestic. It's true in cars, it's true in everything, and it's true in music. The other things that are interesting here are that the US and the UK are kind of a big deal everywhere. So more so than other countries, they're kind of a big deal in every destination. The US is 36% in Australia, 51% in Canada. Now, if you think about other goods, the US is actually a huge deal in movies everywhere, only a big deal in music. So actually, if we're thinking about cultural imperialism, movies is where it's at, much more so than music from the US perspective. All right, so let's get to the questions this is meant to be about. First, the evolution of trade friction. So the way I'm going to look at this is just think about the share of consumption in each destination in the pop chart data that's domestic. Okay, and so what I'm showing you, these indices, I've somehow statistically spliced together the different countries. I have these indices that show you that the domestic shares rise from 4 through 7 and then decline thereafter. Now remember, Spotify appears about 8 and diffuses through about 11, or well, it's diffusing to today, it comes to the US in 11. But in any event, this period of, this sort of post-digital period of music retailing, when the iTunes music stores exist and Spotify later comes into existence, we're seeing what I would call declining trade frictions. Now, if you're a cultural protectionist, this is scary. This means that your domestic products across all countries are facing more competition or selling less at home compared to the foreign products. If you throw out the US, which is a big country, so sometimes you want to see if some big country is responsible for everything, you get very much the same pattern with a bit more noise on the right-hand side. So it's not just a US phenomenon. So home shares are declining, extra reason for cultural protectionists to be scared. Now, we can also explore these trade frictions using slightly more sophisticated techniques. Question back there. Oh, hey, how you doing? So I throw out the US as a destination. Just run the regression without the US as a destination. So it's still in the denominator of every other country, but I'm just not letting the US cause the regression pattern to be what it is. All right, so we can also do slightly more sophisticated modeling, which is really meant to show you the kind of mainly the same thing, that is the time trend of those domestic shares. And so rather than talk about the details, let me show you some pictures. Not that picture, that's not a good picture. This is more like a picture. So what this picture shows you is that just this top line that's declining just reproduces the pattern you already saw before, that these home shares are declining. In this case, it's the home bias in a gravity model, but it's really almost one-to-one with just the home shares that are much easier to understand. The reason to bother showing you that is that one thing I can do is splice this new data onto my previous 50 years of data, and let's see how has the world changed. Remember what I said before was that surprisingly, that the interest in domestic products had risen in the last few years, or the last decade or so, running up to 2005, and indeed that's this rise in this green line. Well, taking off the modesty panel, look what happened, a reversal. So in the digital era, we're experiencing a reversal of whatever it was that was happening that I claimed might have been comforting to, at least to protectionists in the period around 2005. Okay, so far, trade frictions appear to be declining since digitization. Now the next step is to go and compare the pop charts to streaming. Because again, in this latter period, make an apples to apples comparison, but look at streaming, because streaming is probably informative about the future. It's a very frictionless environment, if you will. So what am I going to do here? I'm just literally going to compare the home shares on pop charts versus Spotify, or I should say Spotify divided by pop charts. So if the home shares on Spotify and pop charts were the same, we'd be at a ratio of 1. If the home share on Spotify is lower, meaning trade is more frictionless in Spotify, then the ratio would be below 1. So you see there are a bunch of countries for which the ratio is below 1, meaning in some sense trade looks more frictionless for those countries. And those are, well, you can see which countries they are. It's Austria, Belgium, Australia, Finland, Germany, France, Spain, UK. Okay. So lower home shares on Spotify suggest smaller frictions with streaming, and streaming kind of quote most benefits producers from, anyways, these countries. Now, some other findings on relative frictions. I should say I'm not going to torture you with gravity models, but you get similar looking results from the gravity models. And also the apparent benefit of Spotify to Scandinavia is not a mechanical artifact, because again, as I mentioned, we weight the countries by their size. Okay, next question is, does consumption converge across countries? I think there's something wrong with the slide heading there. This my verb-subject agreement. But in any event, is there convergence? So how am I going to do this? Each country consumes a bundle of music from other countries. So think about in each country, there's the fraction of music consumed in Germany, from France, from the US, and so forth. That sums to 1, those shares. So each destination country has one of those vectors. Well, how similar are those vectors across countries, across all pairs of countries? And do they become more similar over time? If so, if the distance gets smaller, then consumption's converging. All right? And so what's happening? And I think, why do we ask this question? In some sense, in the cultural trade business, I think people are worried not just about convergence, but especially about convergence to consumption that's heavily US origin. But anyways, what do we find? So the answer is yes. In the recent period, we do see a lot of convergence. We see a decline in these pairwise distances from a number like 0.5 on average, as an average distance between these destination pairs, to a number like 0.3. So that's a pretty big convergence. That's a pretty big change. Now, moreover, you can do this consumption comparison back to 50 years ago or so, and indeed there was a divergence followed by this recent convergence. Okay. So again, it's not obvious to me whether this is a good or a bad thing. But I put it up there because there sometimes are discussions of this among the folks who do worry about encroachment on culture from other countries. Yeah, so is it good or bad? So here are some of the hegemons, right? You all know, in this audience, you all know where these folks are from. They're not Americans, they're Canadians. Okay, okay. All right, so convergence to whose consumption then is the next question. So whose consumption are we converging to? This is going to be a little bit surprising. Now, what we're looking at here is which countries are closest, to whose country is consumption closest over time. And so a low bar means it's closer. It's closest to Portugal in 2007 and furthest from France on average, the set of countries we have here. Now what you notice over time is the height of the bars in general go down. We already saw that. That's just the convergence in general. But if you're asking to whose consumption does it converge, I mean, the thing that's a little surprising, it tends to be Portugal and Switzerland. So here are these scary fellas here. Now, it's not because we're all consuming their music. It's because those are small countries that don't have big domestic products. They don't have big domestic shares. So, I mean, this is a bit misleading, but it's certainly the answer is not that we're all converging to US consumption. Rather, those countries have very little domestic and therefore a very small domestic home bias or home share. And so that's why it looks like we're converging to them. Okay, small domestic shares. Now, another question we can ask then is, do sales concentrate in particular origin countries? Are particular origin countries then becoming more responsible for the world, plate of music that's being consumed? And the maybe surprising answer, or maybe not, is that it tends not to be. The origin repertoire shares, the HHIs are declining. So, another way to say that is just becoming less concentrated recently in particular origins. It's getting more spread across origin countries. And I guess in some sense, one of the punchlines here is to say, well, all right, let's think about particular origins. How are they doing as a share of the world market in the pop chart data? And what's interesting here is that the US is kind of doing, well, increasingly poorly. The US was at 60% and now is down at about 35%. Now, I should just remind you what these data are, right? These are pop charts They vary across country between numbers like, sometimes it's the top 50 depending on the country, the top 100, and there are various bits of ledger domain that have to be applied to the data to make them into shares. I would take more from the trend than the level, but I think the trend is interesting. The US is declining and other countries tend to be rising, right? So in this story of increasing digitization. So where are we? Our consumption is growing more similar. The mix of consumption is growing less concentrated across origin, and it's not increasingly US heavy. Right, so we can ask which repertoires kind of win under digitization. We already did that for the pop charts, but we can go farther and ask about it in Spotify versus in pop charts for 2014 and 15. And so this is a similar kind of graph to what we had before. Again, what if these are now each origin country's share of world sales, where the world is these countries, and if the share in Spotify were equal to the share in pop charts, then we'd be at 1. But if it's for the countries for which it's below, are countries in some sense that are doing worse with more frictionless trade, and the countries that are above 1 are in some sense doing better. So here we do see the conquest of the Vikings. We have Norway and Sweden out here to the right. I think Denmark is also above parity. And we have most of the relatively big countries, not all of them, are below parity, meaning in some sense not doing well with fully frictionless trade. So here are some big countries, and then there are some small ones. The UK is an exception to my claim, and there are other exceptions to my claim too. But it is true that of the biggest countries tend to live on the hurt side of this line, and so there is a David and Goliath element to this story of really frictionless trade, kind of making the small countries that don't tend to trade so well in the pre-digital era do better in the digital era. Okay, so cultural protectionists feared that technology would promote large country, especially US dominance, and digitization is an extra scary development. If you think about technology as being scary, digitization is extra scary, but a funny thing happened. Well, on the one hand, yeah, there are reduced frictions, both over time in the pop chart data and with streaming relative to sales, and moreover, consumption's converging, which some people find troubling. But for a bunch of smaller markets, the lost sales at home, and we can infer there are lost sales at home because the home shares are going down, are more than made up for by additional sales abroad. Okay, so the protectionist nightmare is not quite as feared. Markets and technology, I mean, the implication here is at least some evidence that markets and technology may be a better friend to small markets than regulation. And so some more fair use here. Yeah, how I learned to stop worrying about digitization and love the bomb. Okay, thanks. Yep. Right. So great question. So what we do, it's usually somebody's born there, but there are folks, I mean, I think of it where they're first commercialized. So we could fight about Rihanna. Is she from Barbados or is she US? Yeah, right. So, but I mean, that said, for some folks who talk about cultural trade, they would say, you know what, all rock music is American. I don't care if it's sung by Swedes in English, it's still American, or Swedes in Swedish. I don't agree with that because I think we don't say, I mean, the automobile was invented in Germany. Are they all German? But people have serious fights about that. And so it's a really interesting question, the one you're asking. So mostly we go with where you're born, but where you first commercialize is another way to do it, yeah.
Carlson from Revolution Digital Distribution based in Germany. And the thing that struck me is that we've talked a lot about the long tail theory and what that has meant for individual artists. And it looks from what you're saying that the long tail theory is perhaps working from a country market perspective. So I found that quite interesting that there does seem to be a democratization from your research.
Yes, I would say that's exactly what's going on. I mean, a way to think about these results is that this is some version of this is long tails across borders. And by the way, just about long tails in general, it is true, music compared to books and movies and other cultural products are way more concentrated in a small number of products selling a lot. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a long tail phenomenon, because the question is not just what ends up selling a lot, but whether digitization allowed new products to come into existence that then end up in the right tail. And so, I mean, so just on your question, though, I think, yes, I do think of this as showing some evidence of a long tail. I mean, in some ways, the stacks or cards are stacked against us because we only have the top 200 songs by week, by country. So we're missing the entire, you know, we have really just the head of the distribution. So maybe if we had all the data that we wish we had, please, you know, we yeah. But yes, I agree.
I was just going to point out a corollary to Joshua's point that you also have to take into consideration the origin of the writers, right? You count that Katy Perry songs written by Swedes, then of course you're going to count them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, so I don't know if one has to, but it's a different, interesting question. I mean, so you're right. I mean, if we were to think about who gets paid, and yeah, I agree it would be interesting. It'd be hard work too.
Is there, you know, outside, I apologize, I don't know the details at all, but you think about, I saw on one of the graphs, Canada was very, very high. Of course, Canada has very strict parameters on their radio airplay that they have to play Canadian content.
Right.
Are there any other countries in your model that are doing that? Does that have a correlation with success or failure?
France does. France has a 40% rule.
Wow.
Yeah. But I mean, that's only on radio, it's not on Spotify, but still promotion occurs. So yeah, France does. I mean, New Zealand does. I don't think they're in these data. Yeah, so a number of countries actually still do that. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that scares people about digitization, because digital consumption, I mean, the radio is slowly disappearing, and unregulated forms of consumption and promotion are emerging in their place.
So I've often noticed there's sometimes a correlation, high correlation between what's popular in the UK and here, and sometimes not. I spoke on a panel there in 2000 because they were worried that they weren't planning a lot of hits in the American charts. So I'm wondering, it feels like there's still going to be, it's a much smaller population, and they're going to be fed by different parameters. You know, in 2000, one of the things was they were very heavily into EDM. EDM wasn't really popular in the States yet. So isn't it still possible? I know it will make it easier for individual success stories to happen, but how much do you expect it to break down those kinds of barriers?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, it's just, I think it does make it easier for particular artists to migrate from one place to another, but I don't know how some of this feels like it's going to be, there's cycles of genres that are rise and fall.
Yeah. No, I mean, and moreover, some of it is just particular artists who are huge. Like Canada, this happens to be the period where Drake and Bieber are a big deal. And so it's not clear whether Drake and Bieber get generated every year or just once every decade or once every 3 decades. So that's a perfectly good point. I mean, the other thing that I think speaks to your point is, well, let me see if it does. If you look at this whole half century going back and ask, well, who's really disproportionately big? Turns out, and maybe this won't surprise people in the room, the answer is not the US. The US actually is smaller. Its share of world trade was traditionally smaller than its share of world GDP. The monsters were the UK, and it wasn't the 60s, it was the 80s. In the 80s, the UK was at its share of world trade was 5 times its share of world GDP. And the other monsters have occasionally been Australia and Sweden. But it's sort of interesting. And I mean, I guess it's related to your question in the sense that, are those long-term sustainable, or are those just episodic, having to do with 5 artists who are monstrous at some point in time? The UK, I think it's more sustainable, because even with the rise and fall of the UK music empire, they still are kind of consistently above, but the others were just episodically above. So I think that does speak to your point. Right.
But here, it doesn't seem like there's any elimination of the local players. It's just increasing choice. Nobody's shutting down their music businesses. I'm not seeing any evidence of that from this. But the fact that this is this zero marginal cost digital product is just unambiguously increasing
Yep.
So how does that translate into cultural harm in some sense?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, so that's what I would have thought as an economist. There are, though, people who are concerned, who actually would not take any comfort in what I point out, that what you lose at home, you pick up abroad, because they're merely upset that people are not at home consuming the home product. I mean, think about how the French feel about the decline of French cuisine in France. It's no comfort to them that French cuisine is a big world cuisine, but it's upsetting to them that hamburgers are being consumed in France. And so, and I'm not trying to make a joke here. I mean, seriously, there are people who care about what's being consumed at home, not merely how much our domestic sellers selling. But to your point, you know, I have to make an Amazon comment too. I mean, if you think about, so make a Netflix comment on the way to an Amazon comment. I mean, how do you consume Norwegian movies in the U.S.? You know, actually, I consume Danish movies and Norwegian television through Netflix, but if you actually check and see what's available where, it turns out almost everything's available at Amazon across borders, whereas it's almost impossible in the non-digital world to consume across borders. I don't think there's much of a threat to entry because costs have fallen so much in everything that I almost think that the cultural debate is moot, but the people who feel that way don't feel that it's moot. I mean, instead, I feel like it's really just opportunity for the Norwegians to sell here.
Everybody wants data. You, David, with Pandora, presumably has better data than,
I've got it.
Than you do.
Uh-oh. Did I press the wrong button? No, I'm okay. Almost. View. Full screen. Okay. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about advertising as a revenue source and how do consumers interact with advertising. So on Pandora, and I think similar things are true for Spotify and Google/YouTube, we have more than 10 times as many ad-supported listeners as we do paid subscribers. So a lot of the money coming to fund the music industry from our perspective is happening from advertising. I'm in fact, my title is that I'm an advertising scientist now at Pandora. So this work that I'm going to show you is the reason that I joined Pandora. This experiment had just been, so I've spent my entire career promoting the use of experiments in economics, and when I interviewed at Pandora, they told me about this experiment that had just started, and I realized if I go to Pandora, I'm going to get to play with this experiment, which is going to be one of the coolest things I've gotten to do in my career. What we're going to do is measure consumer sensitivity to audio advertising using a really massive experiment. My co-author on this is Nick Riabov, who actually just graduated from Brown University. He was my intern at Pandora, and he's now working for Netflix, actually. So Pandora, we know, is internet radio. We're paying for the listening by audio advertising. Actually, audio ads are really the unique kind of ad that Pandora, I feel like it's our unique value proposition in the advertising space. Audio ads are much more attention getting than other ads that happen online, in my opinion. And I'm starting to try to collect data on that as well. So audio ads make up, I think, on the order of half of all of Pandora's revenue. We also sell video ads and display ads in addition to our subscriptions. So the question is, what's consumer demand for listening look like? So basically I'm going to estimate a demand curve where the price is how many ads per hour do you have to listen to, and we're going to vary that across consumers. And so I, like for my economist friends, I have been calling this the best demand curve ever estimated. I'll let you correct me on that if you feel like I've missed something, but I'm just super excited about this. So we ran this experiment from June 2014 to April 2016. And the design of the experiment was as follows. We have 9 different treatment groups. We varied, I forgot to make a good slide for this, so I'm just going to describe it verbally. We vary both the number of commercial interactions per hour and the number of ads per commercial interruption. And the time we started this experiment, our default was, what we were doing for most listeners was 4 commercial interruptions per hour and 1.5 ads per interruption. That is, we would alternate between 1 and 2 ads per commercial break. So what we're going to do in this experiment is we're going to go both up and down from each of those parameters. So the design is 3 by 3. The 3 treatments on commercial interruptions are either we do 3, 4, or 6 per hour, and we do either 1, 1.5, or 2 ads per commercial break. So that's the experiment, and I've got 1 million people in each of my treatment groups. So we're able to measure things really precisely. Let's see, anything else I need to say about the design? No, I think that's it. So the first thing that we do whenever we run an experiment is check to make sure that all the people in the different treatment groups were in fact identical to each other. And sometimes you think that you've randomized, but you accidentally had some correlation with some variable. So we checked all of our listeners before the experiment started. All 9 groups matched on total hours they listened, on total days they were active, on total revenue that we've earned from them on audio ads, and so on. And so you can see the results of our various tests there all failed to reject the hypothesis that they were equal. Now, the thing that makes the experiment complicated to analyze is that when I say we had 3, 4, or 6 commercial breaks per hour, that's not literally true, because we only do a commercial break when a song ends, right? And so the song may not be ending exactly at the 15-minute mark since the last time you heard an ad, right? So we're going to get different numbers here than what I said we intended. And similarly, we don't always sell every ad opportunity, right? Different advertisers put different targeting on their ads, and they put different frequency caps on. So sometimes when I'm listening to Pandora, at a certain point during the day, all of the advertisers who are trying to reach me have had their frequency caps met, and so now we no longer have any ad to play for that particular instance, and so we don't play an ad, we just play more music. There is not currently a well-developed spot market for ads, audio ads, the way there is for display ads. So sometimes we just have missing ad opportunities. All right, so how long is an ad? They are all 30 seconds or less. Here's what we actually managed to achieve. So the control group had was the middle of that 3 by 3 matrix that I was talking about. In addition to having, so I had a 3 by 3 matrix with 1 million people in each of the cells, and in addition I had another control group that kind of replicates that center cell, where we're trying to deliver 6 ads per hour, 4 times 1.5. So in the control group, where I was trying to do 4 times 1.5 equals 6 ads per hour, I actually managed to deliver 4 ads per hour on average. In the lowest ad load treatment, we managed to get just under 3, and in the highest ad load treatment, we managed to get 5.4 ads per hour. So that's the actual variation that we're going to be able to exploit when we estimate our demand curve. And similarly, you can see how many ads. I use the word pod to describe a commercial break. So we had between 1.07 and 1.45 ads per pod, and we had between 2.8 and 3.7 pods per hour. And you can see our sample sizes, in control I had 17 million, and I have 1.7 million in each of the other groups. So we can see clearly that doing more ads per hour does in fact drive down listening. So we do have a downward sloping demand curve, just like I was hoping. And then the question is, how steep is that demand curve? So if we look at total hours, so I've normalized total hours to be 100 for the control group, and the highest ad load only had 97% as much listening in terms of total hours as the control group did. The lowest ad load, they actually increased their listening relative to the control, even though people were presumably used to that number of ads. When we lowered the number of ads, they actually listened more. I'm going to skip that. Here is the big picture, what I'm calling the best demand curve ever. So you can see the control group in red there. What you're seeing is the actual realized ad load here on this axis, and the total hours listened. So this is the quantity consumed on the vertical axis. So we ran this experiment for 20 months, and at the end of the experiment, we measured how much listening happened in the month after we've done all of it. Or sorry, in the final month of the experiment. So in the 20th month of the experiment, how much listening is happening. And you can see this just beautiful demand curve that is linear. It looks just like an Econ 101 textbook diagram, except I've flipped the axes because I like having dependent variables on the on the vertical whenever I can. This shows us the slope, and you can see it's not a terribly elastic demand curve. The folks are not super sensitive to the ads, but they're clearly sensitive. They do react to the ads. We cannot just, clearly we can't play, 98% ads and expect everybody else to stay around. And what's that? I am not at liberty to say. You can try to compute it for yourself there, but that was one of the things that in my negotiation with Pandora I wasn't going to put into the paper. So let's see. This answers your question probably better. I'm not giving you the elasticity number, but increasing ad load by 1 unit per hour, it's a 1 ad per hour for 20 months, and you saw what the mean was around 4 ads per hour, so you can do the calculation if you want. 1 unit per hour for 20 months leads to a 2% decrease in hours and active days relative to the control. So that's the big number that we've been working with. We managed to get a 2% decrease in listening for every 1 ad per hour we increased. So let's see if we can decompose that into the different kinds of intensities of listening behavior that people do. So here's the effect. So sorry if I didn't make these slides very pretty. So this is very legible to econometricians and perhaps not so legible to the rest of us. So let me just tell you, this is the row we care about. This tells us for every 1 ad per hour increase, what is the decrease in listening? And I've got 4 different variables that I'm measuring. So the first one is what's total hours listened. So as I said, that goes down by 2% for each ad per hour. The next one is how many hours did you listen per day that you listened, right? So that's a different margin of listening, and you see, well, that one went down by 0.36. Then how many fewer days did you listen? That's minus 0.9. So we lose almost 1 day per month of listening whenever we've increased ads by 1 ad per hour. This is a poorly labeled column. This is, did you listen at all? Right, so the 3 different margins that I'm looking at are, did you listen at all? Given that you listened at all, how many days did you listen? And given that you listened on a given day, how many hours did you listen? What were the decreases there? Well, you can see that like about half the effect was scaring people off entirely, and then 40-some% of the effect was people listening fewer days, and then the remainder, about 10% of the effect was people listening fewer hours on the days that they did listen. Okay. Increasing ad load by 1 unit per hour for 20 months, how does that influence subscriptions? So I've shown that we have a downward sloping demand curve for the product itself. We've got this complementary product, which is subscriptions. Does it affect their behavior at all? Yes. As we would predict, the complementary good gets an increase in demand, and it goes up by about 0.15%. The probability of being a subscriber goes up by about 15%. So this is a regression in which all I have is an intercept, and were you a subscriber at the beginning of the period, and how many ads per hour were you listening to? And by the way, for the econometricians, this is an instrumental variables estimation where I am doing 1 dummy variable for each treatment group. And so I'm basically, I should not tangle myself up too much here. Basically, the whole thing is captured in this diagram, right? Each treatment group has a different mean ad load, number of ads per hour actually realized, and then I compute the slope of the line that's for the whatever it is I'm trying to measure in consumer behavior. I compute the slope of the line of that y relative to the x of the ads per hour. In this case, we're going to be looking at subscribers. You're not in this regression if you were a subscriber the whole time, because then you never got any ads. So this is people who were a subscriber at the beginning. They were much more likely to be a subscriber at the end if they were a subscriber at the beginning. And the ads actually increased the probability of their subscribing to the service. You can also see on this slide, we look at listener churn. It's very similar to the result that I just showed you. This is actually, the outcome here is, did you not listen to Pandora at all for the last 2 months of the experiment? And the probability of not listening to Pandora at all for the last 2 months of the experiment actually goes up by 0.4%. So we do get more subscribers when we play more ads, but we actually lose more customers altogether than we gain subscribers. Let's see. Different age groups have different treatment effects. That's actually, let's see. I don't know if I want to show it this way. Yeah, I guess what I want to show you is the subscriber one, which I think is most interesting. So ignore the red triangles and let's just look at the blue circles. So younger people, not that likely to subscribe as a result of getting additional ads. Older people, much more likely to subscribe as a result of getting additional ads. Right? This is mostly being driven by the older folks and is monotonically increasing in age. Impact of treatment on hours listened actually doesn't differ much by demographic group. So here are 4 different lines that I've plotted for these 4 different age groups. You can see they all have almost exactly the same slope, although they have different levels. So the 25 to 54-year-olds are listening more than the 13 to 17-year-olds on average. This is something that you can actually tell from this demand curve. It doesn't matter much, like this demand curve is pretty linear. It doesn't matter much whether I'm doing 6 interruptions with 1.5 ads per interruption or whether I'm doing 4 interruptions with 2 ads per interruption. Those are about the same. They are on different sides of this line, so maybe there's some effect. Let's try to look at that separately. So what I'm doing here is I have 2 variables in my regression. One, how many pods per hour, and the other, as before, how many ads per hour. So I'm just adding this separate variable, which I know varies independently because I made it vary in the experiment. And so you can see that the number of pods per hour does not matter much at all compared to the number of ads per hour. You know, controlling for number of ads per hour, the pods per hour doesn't actually matter much. So it doesn't seem to matter whether all that matters is how many ads per hour. It doesn't matter how we place them during the hour of listening. Let's see, attrition by treatment group. So, oh yes, this is really key. The point I want to make here is it's really important that we ran this experiment for almost 2 years. Because if we had just run this experiment for a couple of months, we would have thought that the elasticity of demand was super small. It took a long time for the full amount of treatment effect to be realized. We started this thing in June of 2014, and the slope, the amount of listening is still going down in September of 2015, right? So I'm really pleased we were able to run this experiment for long enough to know what was the final answer. You can see it finally leveled off for like the last 6 months of the experiment. So we said, all right, fine, we can finish this experiment and start running a new one. And so I have a new one running now, asking slightly different questions. So increasing ad load by 1 audio ad per hour for 20 months leads to a 2% decrease in hours listened. Paid subscriptions go up by about 1/3 of the loss in listeners. The effects vary by age, particularly the subscription results, that the older people were much more likely to be induced into a subscription than the younger people were. And the effects depend only on total ads per hour, not on the number of interruptions or the number of ads per interruption. Yes?
You mentioned that they're not super sensitive. Anecdotally, I tend
anecdotally, I tend to view Pandora listening as pretty passive
Mhm.
as compared to perhaps Spotify.
Okay.
So I'm wondering when I see things like that, whether it's just someone sits down at their desk and turns it on and leaves it for the day. So
Right.
did you think about possibly looking at the mechanism by which they're listening, whether it was browser or the app or something like that?
So one weakness of this experiment was we only had the engineering resources to do this on one platform. So the experimental variation only happens on mobile listening, which represents like 80% of our listening. The total hours that I provide for you are all of the hours listened on any platform. So when I showed you that we increased the number of ads per hour, that was taking into account all the ads you've ever gotten on all the platforms, all the hours you've listened on all of our platforms. And so there's less variation than I intended with the experiment because the variation only happened mobile. The experiment that I'm currently running, we actually managed to vary the ad load separately by platform. So I am not yet able to answer your question, but I may be able to a year from now.
Hi, I'm Steve Herskovich for Reiley. I had a question about, you didn't do any variation within persons. What I'm curious about is whether the longer you were listening, if you're going to cut out at relatively longer commercial breaks, and if you had any data to look at that.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand the question. It's, are people more likely to stop listening when they encounter a particularly long commercial break? Is that right? Yeah. I don't have any systematic variation in that. There's some naturally occurring variation, but I would be very reluctant to use that to say that there's a causal effect there, because like you end up with shorter commercial breaks, perhaps the more hours you listen in the day, because you tend to run into those frequency caps, and then we don't have enough ads to play for you at the end, and I don't want to use that and say, oh, that caused. That would probably be a spurious correlation. So I think to answer your question, I would probably have to design an experiment that experimented within subjects. And I'm worried that will be really hard to do because clearly the effects of varying ad load are very long lasting and consumers are slow to react to them. So it's going to be hard for me to do an experiment where I like put you in one treatment today and a different treatment tomorrow and know what the actual total effect was. So it may be a very hard question to answer, but I will think about it.
I'll jump in with the most basic question of all. Has the company changed any standard ad loads or anything as a result of these findings?
Yes. We certainly have. and I'm continuing to explore what ad loads. So, we only explored a small area of the space, and so we have changed our ad load, and we are continuing to explore the space of possible ad loads we might do. Yeah, sorry for being so tight-lipped about it. It was. I'm so grateful to Pandora that I am actually allowed to publish these results externally at all, and so we've been careful about which things we share and which things we don't. Sure. I mean, certainly Pandora has invested heavily over the past year in our subscription service, right? We now have an on-demand premium service in addition to our Pandora Plus, radio service. So we have been betting on increased subscriptions, but I don't feel like I'm an expert on that. It's something that we are very interested in, but I don't feel like I have anything to add to that other than what the company's chosen to do.
I don't know if there's any research already done on terrestrial radio, but have you made any comparisons to what would happen, the effects from this study versus changes in ad loads on terrestrial radio?
Yeah, we've thought about that. So our ad loads are way lower than terrestrial radio ad loads are. Yes, I've thought about that, and I might even be willing to talk to you about it privately, but not in the public forum. But we did make that comparison. There's some pretty interesting comparisons there that I'm not really at liberty to talk about in public. Yeah, my teammates on the ad science team are actively working on that. I don't think we do a terribly good job of that right now, but we have some good ideas that we're trying to implement at the moment to make our ad relevance better. I would say we have more targeting options on Pandora than folks do in broadcast radio, right? The best you can do is sort of pick a particular format and advertise there and know that you're going to be getting these particular demographic mix. But whereas on Pandora you can say, oh, I only want to advertise to people who are between the ages of 21 and 31 who live in Wisconsin and who are female, and we also import other data sometimes. We can even say, you're only going to play this in the morning, or we're only going to play this in the evening, or we'll play it on weekends or whatever. So there are plenty of targeting attributes we have that advertisers choose, but we're not doing a whole lot of automation of helping advertisers find the right targets, and it's something that we're working on improving.
The free ad load version of Pandora includes a thumbs up and thumbs down for every song.
That's right.
Maybe for a short time you could consider adding that capability for the ads.
Thumbing the ads, yes.
And, I just want to ask you, and this applies to all services, I believe, can you give us some idea of how the ad revenue versus the subscription or plus revenue compares to one another if you were to normalize it per user?
Yeah.
Just to see what the motivation is to go for the subscription service on the services.
So wait, you're talking about, how much revenue do we make per listener? Yeah, we certainly make more revenue on average from the subscription products than we do from the advertising. I'm not sure that I know, and if I know, I'm not sure I'm allowed to say. So I'm gonna beg off on that one.
But Pandora still would rather have subscriptions and plus clients rather than the free.
For the vast majority of customers, we think we would be better off with a subscriber than with an ad-supported listener, but many listeners have shown us very clearly that they are much happier with ads than with subscriptions, so we want to serve them too. Yes?
Hi, Samantha Klausner. I'm an independent artist as well as a blogging career. I just wanted to mention that Pandora does something that I find pretty unique in that during the ad space, some of the artists that you actually listen to are advertising their concerts
Yes.
in your area. And
Yes.
as a consumer, that's really cool. I use Songkick personally, but Pandora does a great job at, educating their consumers about where they're playing live.
Yes, we thank you for that compliment. We are working on doing even better at that. We have some cool things that I hope you'll hear about in a year over the course of the next year.
Artists who love us, it's nice to hear their voice, what they sound like out
Yes.
there. Their album is personal.
Yes, she's talking about our artist audio messaging product, where the artist can log in and actually record a message, just using their app on their phone. They can record a message, and we will stick it sometimes before or after the song that's played.
My name is Dave Morgan, royalty claim that you mentioned, but my question is in regards to kind of around the ad quality question, but more about the frequency of the same ad served to individual user. Did that come into play in your analysis? Looking at, you said that obviously people sort of drop off a little bit if you serve them more ads, but was there diversity in ad, or was it more the same ad served multiple times?
There was probably a fair amount of serving the same ad multiple times. It's going to depend on the listener and how many different advertisers we're trying to reach that listener. So, in some cases we have 16 different advertisers all trying to reach a listener on the same day, and so they may not listen long enough to hear all 16. But in other cases, somebody listens for 12 hours and we only had 8 advertisers trying to reach them, you're going to hear the same ad multiple times. And I don't know the answer to your question about exactly how much lowering of ad diversity happened as a result of the increase in ad load. That's something we can look at. Of course, it's not independently varying, so it'll be very hard for me to say how much of the effect is due to decreased diversity as opposed to just the sheer number of ads. So right now, I'm lumping both of those effects together and saying it's the increased number of ads. Looks like we're done. All right. Thanks very much.